For an island nation, the sea has always been both a barrier and a highway, a source of danger and a path to prosperity. Before the grand voyages of the Age of Exploration, England's maritime identity was forged in centuries of conflict and commerce. The most profound early influence was undoubtedly the Viking Age. From the late 8th century, Scandinavian longships brought a wave of raids, trade, and settlement that forced Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to confront the need for naval defense. Alfred the Great, in the late 9th century, is credited with commissioning purpose-built warships to counter these incursions, creating the embryonic form of an English navy. Over the next 200 years, the integration of Norse culture into areas like the Danelaw transformed English society, embedding deep seafaring traditions and sophisticated shipbuilding knowledge. This period did not see the formation of a unified naval force, but rather the proliferation of local maritime skills and trade-focused port towns. The Norman conquest of 1066 marked a new chapter, as William the Conqueror's reliance on a massive fleet to invade the island underscored the strategic importance of naval power. To secure his coastal defences, he established the Confederation of the Cinque Ports in the southeast. These 5 towns, Hastings, New Romney, Hythe, Dover, and Sandwich, were granted special privileges in return for providing ships and men for the royal fleet, an arrangement that served as the primary naval defence for centuries. This feudal system of naval service, while effective for coastal protection and occasional campaigns, was not the basis for a global presence. It was a defensive, not an expansionist, maritime structure. Concurrent with these developments, medieval England was becoming an active participant in European trade networks. The export of high-quality wool formed the backbone of the economy, driving the growth of ports like London, Bristol, and King's Lynn. This commerce brought English merchants into direct contact with the powerful Hanseatic League, a confederation of northern European trading guilds that dominated the North and Baltic seas. The Hanseatic merchants, with their fortified steel yard in London, held a near monopoly on trade routes, dictating terms and suppressing competition. While this relationship was economically vital, it also highlighted England's status as a subordinate trading partner. This dependence on a foreign power for maritime commerce would fuel later English efforts to build a national fleet and secure an independent commercial identity, setting the stage for a new era of ambition beyond Europe's shores. The transition from medieval coastal defence to imperial ambition was not a sudden leap for England, but a gradual shift shaped by a new era of global discovery. The Tudor dynasty, particularly under Henry VII, provided the first cautious royal patronage for overseas exploration. While Spain and Portugal were carving up the globe with the voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama, England's focus remained on more pragmatic, low-risk ventures. This cautious approach was epitomized by the expedition of John Cabot, a Venetian merchant and mariner who, in 1497, received a patent from Henry VII to seek out, discover, and find whatsoever isles, countries, regions, or provinces of the heathen and infidels, whatsoever they may be, and in what part of the world soever they be, which before this time have not been known to all Christians. Cabot's voyage aboard the ship, Matthew took him across the North Atlantic, where he made landfall somewhere on the coast of what is now Canada. He was the first European to do so since the Vikings, and his discovery provided England with a crucial claim to North American territory. However, Cabot's expedition was not met with a rush of follow-up voyages. While he returned to England with reports of cod-rich fishing grounds, he had not found the fabled route to Asia or the gold and spices that fueled Spanish and Portuguese expansion. Henry VII, a monarch known for his fiscal prudence, saw little immediate return on investment. A second voyage in 1498, with 5 ships, ended in disaster, with Cabot and his fleet disappearing without a trace. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The lack of sustained Tudor interest in overseas expansion during this period can be attributed to several factors. Internally, the dynasty was preoccupied with consolidating power after the Wars of the Roses. Externally, England was a secondary power, focused on maintaining a fragile balance of power with France and Spain. The Reformation under Henry VIII further diverted the crown's attention and resources to domestic and European affairs, including the dissolution of the monasteries and the establishment of the Church of England. This period also saw England's first formal naval build-up, not for global exploration, but for defence against potential invasion from the continent. Henry VIII's creation of a permanent royal navy, with its advanced carracks and galleons, was a strategic necessity driven by European rivalries, not colonial dreams. It was a fleet built to protect England, not to project its power across oceans. Thus, for much of the Tudor era, while the theoretical basis for a British Empire had been established by Cabot's voyage, the practical ambition and resources were simply not yet in place to act upon it. The seed of empire had been planted, but it lay dormant, waiting for a more favourable political and economic climate to take root. I hope this new chapter meets your requirements. Please let me know if you would like any revisions. With England's maritime power still in its infancy, the reign of Elizabeth I saw a strategic shift from direct state-sponsored exploration to a more opportunistic form of naval warfare, privateering. This practice, in which the Crown issued letters of marque to private individuals, sanctioned what was essentially state-sponsored piracy against rival nations, most notably Spain. The Sea Dogs, as these captains were known, served both the monarch and their own commercial interests, blurring the line between patriotism and plunder. This was not yet an empire of colonies, but an empire of profit extracted from the maritime trade of others. The justification was rooted in religious and political tensions. England, a Protestant nation, was in constant conflict with Catholic Spain, which controlled a vast global empire and was seen as a threat to English sovereignty. The most famous of these privateers was Sir Francis Drake, whose exploits became legendary and directly contributed to the early accumulation of English wealth. Drake's most profitable venture was his circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580 aboard the Golden Hind. While ostensibly an exploratory voyage, its true purpose was to raid Spanish settlements and treasure ships along the Pacific coast of South America, a region Spain considered its private lake. Drake's raids on ports like Valparaiso and his capture of the treasure galleon Nuestra Señora de la Concepción yielded a fortune in silver, gold, and jewels. He returned to England a national hero, and the treasure he brought back was so immense that it reportedly paid off the nation's foreign debt and provided a significant investment for the Levant Company. Other notable sea dogs included Sir John Hawkins, a pioneer of the English slave trade, and Sir Walter Raleigh, who, while known for his failed colonization attempts at Roanoke, was also an active privateer. These ventures served a dual purpose. First, they weakened Spain's financial ability to wage war, disrupting the flow of silver from the Americas that funded its armies. Second, they provided a crucial training ground for English mariners and naval commanders, equipping them with invaluable experience in long-distance voyages, naval combat, and logistical planning. The lessons learned in these raids, including the importance of maneuverability and firepower, would prove decisive in 1588, when the Spanish Armada, a massive invasion force, sailed to depose Elizabeth and restore Catholicism. It was not the lumbering Spanish galleons, but the faster, more agile ships of the English Navy captained and crewed by many of the same privateers that inflicted the decisive defeat. This victory not only saved England from invasion, but established it as a major maritime power, setting the stage for the true dawn of its own colonial empire. Following the profitable era of privateering, English ambitions turned from raiding to establishing a permanent foothold in the New World. The first significant effort was centered on Roanoke Island, located off the coast of present-day North Carolina. This ambitious but ultimately ill-fated venture was spearheaded by Sir Walter Raleigh, who received a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I in 1584 to establish a colony. Raleigh's initial reconnaissance mission provided glowing reports of the region, leading to the first colonization attempt in 1585. This expedition, led by Sir Richard Grenville, established a military outpost on the island with approximately 107 men, including a scientist and cartographer named Thomas Harriot and the artist John White, who would later play a more pivotal role. The first Roanoke settlement was plagued by mismanagement and a lack of essential resources. The colonists, many of whom were soldiers, were ill-suited for the demanding agricultural labor required for self-sufficiency. Tensions with the local Native American tribes, initially cooperative, escalated into violent conflict. A critical misstep was a retaliatory attack on a Native American village, which destroyed their crops and further alienated a crucial source of aid. By 1586, the colony was in dire straits, facing starvation and hostility from all sides. It was only the fortuitous arrival of Sir Francis Drake, fresh from a raid on the Spanish Main, that saved the colonists. Drake offered them passage back to England, and they abandoned the settlement completely. Undeterred by this failure, Raleigh organized a second, more serious attempt in 1587. This time, the expedition was designed to be a permanent agricultural colony, composed of 115 men, women, and children under the governorship of John White. The plan was to settle in Chesapeake Bay, but the fleet's captain unexpectedly forced them to land on Roanoke Island. The returning colonists found only the remains of their previous fort. Despite the setbacks, the colony was founded, and on August 18th, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas, was born. John White, recognizing the colony's immediate need for supplies, returned to England later that year, leaving his family behind. What followed was a tragic series of events that sealed the colony's fate. The looming war with Spain and the threat of the Spanish Armada made White's return impossible. Every available ship was commandeered for the defense of England, and White's pleas for a relief mission were repeatedly denied. It was not until 1590 that he was finally able to return to Roanoke. He found the settlement abandoned, the buildings were dismantled, and a single word, Croton, was carved into a post of the stockade. On a nearby tree, the letters Crow were etched. The colonists had vanished, and their fate remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. Theories range from their integration with local tribes to their massacre at the hands of hostile natives, but no definitive evidence has ever been found. The Roanoke fiasco stands as a stark testament to the immense difficulties of early colonization and the vulnerability of these fledgling imperial ambitions. While England's early ventures in the Americas were faltering, a new model for imperial expansion was emerging in the form of the Joint Stock Company. The most significant of these was the East India Company, formally established by a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I on December 31st, 1600. The charter granted the company a 15-year monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. This was a critical moment, as it shifted the burden and risk of long-distance trade and colonization from the Crown to private investors. The company was founded by a group of merchants and financiers, initially with a modest capital of 70,000, who sought to break the Dutch and Portuguese monopoly on the lucrative spice trade. The company's initial voyages were focused on the Spice Islands, of present-day Indonesia. The first voyage, led by Sir James Lancaster in 1601, was a commercial success, returning with a valuable cargo of pepper and other spices. However, the East India Company found itself in direct and often violent competition with the far more powerful Dutch East India Company (VOC), which had established a dominant presence in the region. The Anglo-Dutch rivalry for control of the spice trade was fierce, culminating in the Amboina Massacre of 1623, where 10 English merchants were executed by the Dutch. This event effectively forced the English to retreat from the Spice Islands and seek new opportunities elsewhere. This setback redirected the company's focus from Southeast Asia to the Indian subcontinent. In 1608, Captain William Hawkins, aboard the Hector, landed at Surat, a major Mughal port on the west coast of India. He sought permission from the Mughal Emperor Jahangir to establish a trading factory. While initially met with Portuguese hostility, Hawkins's persistence and the diplomatic efforts of Sir Thomas Roe, an ambassador to the Mughal court, eventually led to the granting of a firman, or royal decree, in 1613. This firman allowed the East India Company to establish its first permanent trading post at Surat. The company's presence in India was primarily commercial, focused on securing valuable textiles, such as cotton and silk, as well as saltpeter for gunpowder and indigo for dyes. The company's success was rooted in its structure as a joint stock company. Investors bought shares, and profits from successful voyages were distributed as dividends. This model allowed for the accumulation of a much larger capital base than had previously been possible for individual merchants, enabling the company to finance extensive voyages, build fortified trading posts factories, and maintain a private army to protect its assets. By the end of the 17th century, the East India Company had transformed from a simple trading venture into a powerful geopolitical entity. It had established a network of fortified trading centres, Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, that would form the nuclei of Britain's eventual territorial empire in India. The initial foray into mercantile capitalism had laid the groundwork for a vast and complex imperial project. While the East India Company was establishing a commercial foothold in Asia, a different model of imperial expansion was underway in North America. The founding of Jamestown in 1607 marked the beginning of England's first permanent and ultimately successful colony on the continent. This venture was not a royal project, but the initiative of the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company granted a charter by King James I to settle the Virginia territory. The company's primary objective was to find gold and a western passage to Asia, not to establish a sustainable settlement. The expedition, consisting of 104 men and boys, sailed across the Atlantic and chose a site on the James River, a location selected for its defensibility but which proved to be a swampy, disease-ridden environment. The early years of Jamestown were a catalogue of disasters, driven by a combination of poor planning, environmental hardship, and the colonists' own lack of preparedness. The initial group was dominated by gentlemen and soldiers who were more interested in prospecting for gold than in farming. The brackish water of the James River, combined with a severe drought, led to rampant disease and famine. The starving time of 1609,610 was the most brutal period, during which the colony's population dwindled from 500 to just 60. Survival was only possible through a precarious and often hostile relationship with the local Powhatan Confederacy, whose leader, Chief Powhatan, was both a source of food and a military threat. The colony's fortunes began to turn with the arrival of new leadership and the discovery of a viable economic commodity. Captain John Smith's rigid discipline and his famous mandate that he that will not work shall not eat provided a temporary stability. However, the true salvation of the colony came from the cultivation of tobacco. In 1612, John Rolfe successfully crossbred local tobacco with a sweeter variety from the West Indies, creating a highly marketable product. This brown gold transformed Virginia's economy, providing the Virginia Company with the profits it desperately sought, and the colonists with a reason to endure. Tobacco cultivation led to a new demand for land and labor, driving the expansion of the colony's footprint and the establishment of the headright system, which granted land to new settlers. This economic transformation had profound social and political consequences. The need for a stable labor force led to the introduction of the first enslaved Africans to Virginia in 1619, a pivotal moment that set the stage for centuries of institutionalized slavery in the Americas. In the same year, the House of Burgesses was established, the first representative assembly in the New World, giving colonists a limited form of self-governance. Jamestown's legacy is thus a complex one. A story of near-total failure rescued by a single cash crop, a beacon of emerging self-rule, and the tragic origin of slavery in what would become the United States. Its initial precariousness gave way to a plantation society that formed the bedrock of Britain's first major colonial project in North America. While the Jamestown settlers were driven by commercial interests, the founding of Plymouth Colony was rooted in religious dissent. The Pilgrims, a group of English religious separatists, believed the Church of England was beyond reform and sought complete separation. Facing persecution from the Crown and the Anglican hierarchy, they first migrated to Leiden, Netherlands, in 1608. Over a decade, they grew concerned that their children were losing their English identity and were being assimilated into Dutch culture. Seeking to preserve their language, heritage, and religious values, they secured a patent from the Virginia Company and arranged passage to the New World. In September 1620, a group of 102 passengers, including separatists and non-separatist strangers hired by merchants, set sail on the ship Mayflower. The voyage was long and arduous, lasting 66 days, and it ultimately took them far off course from their intended destination in the Virginia Territory. Landing in November near Cape Cod, they found themselves outside the legal jurisdiction of their patent. This legal ambiguity prompted the leaders to draft a foundational document of self-governance. The Mayflower Compact, signed by 41 male passengers, established a civil body politic and bound the settlers to obey the laws created for the good of the colony. This act of collective self-determination, though born of necessity, stands as a crucial early precedent for democratic governance in the Americas. The first winter was a period of immense suffering. Poorly prepared for the harsh New England climate, the colonists faced a starving time similar to Jamestown's, exacerbated by scurvy and other diseases. By spring, more than half of the original settlers had died. Their survival was due in large part to the intervention of local Native Americans. In March 1621, they were approached by Samoset, an Abenaki Sagamore, and later by Squanto, a member of the Patuxet tribe who had learned English after being captured and taken to England years earlier. Squanto, acting as an interpreter and guide, taught the Pilgrims how to plant corn, fish, and navigate the local environment. He also introduced them to Massasoit, the paramount chief of the Wampanoag Confederacy, who formed a crucial alliance with the Pilgrims, providing them with protection and ensuring peace. The alliance with the Wampanoag was vital, enabling the Pilgrims to establish a fragile but enduring settlement. The first successful harvest in 1621 was celebrated with a feast of Thanksgiving, a historical event now commemorated as the first Thanksgiving. Plymouth Colony, unlike its commercial counterpart in Jamestown, was founded on the principle of religious liberty for its members. While it never grew to the size or economic power of the Virginia colony, its existence proved that a permanent European settlement could survive in New England. Its legacy is tied to the ideals of religious freedom and self-governance, which would later become foundational to the identity of the future United States. While England's colonies in North America were struggling with survival and religious identity, a different and far more profitable imperial model was taking shape in the Caribbean. Initial English settlements on islands like Barbados and the Leeward Islands in the early 17th century were focused on cultivating modest crops such as tobacco and cotton. These ventures, however, were small-scale and faced stiff competition from Virginia. A pivotal shift occurred in the 1640s, an event often referred to as the Sugar Revolution, which completely transformed the economic and social fabric of the colonies and made them the most valuable possessions in the early British Empire. The catalyst for this revolution was the arrival of Dutch merchants, who, following their own conflicts with Portugal, brought the technical expertise and financial capital needed to grow and process sugarcane. Sugar cultivation was a highly labor-intensive process, demanding massive investment in mills, boilers, and land, far beyond the scope of a small tobacco farmer. This led to a rapid consolidation of land and capital. Small landholders were either bought out or driven into poverty, their plots absorbed into vast, highly efficient plantations. The islands were systematically deforested to make way for monoculture sugarcane fields, fundamentally altering the Caribbean landscape and economy. The most critical component of this new system was the labor force. The immense physical demands of planting, harvesting, and processing sugarcane could not be met by a small number of indentured servants. This created an insatiable demand for a permanent, coerced labor supply, leading to the massive expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. The British Caribbean colonies, particularly Barbados and later Jamaica, became some of the most brutal and highly stratified slave societies in the world. By the mid-17th century, the ratio of enslaved Africans to European colonists on Barbados was as high as 10-1, a demographic reality that shaped all aspects of colonial life, including its legal codes and social hierarchies. The wealth generated by these sugar plantations was staggering. The sugar barons of the Caribbean became some of the wealthiest men in the British Empire, their fortunes funding grand estates in England and securing political influence in Parliament. This immense profitability made the Caribbean colonies a central pillar of Britain's mercantile system. Raw sugar was shipped to England, where it was refined and sold for further profit, creating a lucrative trade route that financed Britain's growing naval power and its ability to compete with European rivals. The success of the sugar plantations established a pattern of imperial exploitation that valued raw resource extraction and coercive labor over sustainable settlement, cementing the Caribbean's role as the economic engine of British imperialism for over a century. The sugar revolution in the Caribbean did not just transform the island's economies, it created a demand for labor that gave rise to a complex and brutal system of trade that would become a cornerstone of the British Empire. This system, known as the triangular trade, was a three-legged circuit of commerce that linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas. It was not a formal, unified entity, but a network of overlapping routes and commercial interests that operated from the 17th to the 19th century. The trade was driven by the insatiable demand for a permanent, large-scale labor force to work the highly profitable plantations in the New World. The first leg of the triangle involved the export of manufactured goods from Europe to West Africa. British ships, particularly from ports like Bristol and Liverpool, carried textiles, copper, iron goods, guns, and alcohol. These goods were not merely commercial products, they were the currency of the slave trade. In West Africa, these items were exchanged with local African rulers and merchants for enslaved people, who were often captured in warfare or through raids on rival communities. This stage of the trade was a complex commercial and political process involving many African and European actors, all of whom profited from the exchange. The second and most infamous leg of the journey was the Middle Passage. This was the forced transatlantic voyage of millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas. Conditions aboard the slave ships were horrific. The enslaved were crammed into the holds and chains with little space, food, or sanitation. Disease was rampant, and mortality rates were high, often reaching 20% or more. The journey, which could last from 1 to 3 months, was a traumatic experience of immense suffering and dehumanization. The sheer scale of the Middle Passage is staggering, with an estimated 3.1 million enslaved Africans transported on British ships alone throughout the duration of the trade. The third leg of the triangle completed the circuit. Once in the Americas, the enslaved people were sold at auction to plantation owners, primarily in the British Caribbean and later in the southern colonies of North America. The profits from these sales were then used to purchase the raw materials produced by the enslaved labor: sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These commodities were then shipped back to Britain, where they were processed and sold for immense profit. This final stage provided the capital that fueled Britain's Industrial Revolution, financed its growing naval power, and enriched a new class of merchants and investors. The profits from the triangular trade were so vast that it became a central pillar of the British economy, making the trade a state-supported and integral component of the early empire's prosperity. Its legacy is a system of racialized chattel slavery that shaped the demographics, legal codes, and social hierarchies of the New World for centuries. The English Civil War, 1642–1651, was a period of intense political and social upheaval that, while primarily a domestic conflict, had profound and often paradoxical effects on England's nascent colonial empire. Preoccupied with the conflict between King Charles I and Parliament, the Home Government was largely unable to exercise direct control over its North American and Caribbean colonies. This period of salutary neglect proved to be a critical moment in the development of colonial identity and institutions. The Crown's authority, already distant, was effectively absent, forcing the colonies to rely on their own resources and internal governance structures. In the New England colonies, this neglect allowed for a period of robust self-governance. The Puritan leadership of Massachusetts Bay Colony, for example, took the opportunity to strengthen their charter government, pass their own laws, and solidify their Congregationalist religious control without interference. They viewed the conflict in England as a validation of their own separation from a corrupt Anglican hierarchy. This autonomy fostered a strong sense of local identity and a tradition of political independence that would be a recurring theme in colonial history. Similarly, in Virginia, the House of Burgesses asserted its authority, managing local affairs and navigating the political landscape of the Civil War from a distance. The colony's population, which had grown to over 20,000, was far too large for any distant authority to control without a standing military presence. The Caribbean colonies, though more directly tied to England's economic interests, also experienced a period of de facto self-rule. Barbados in particular was able to solidify its plantation-based economy and expand its influence, largely unhindered by royal interference. The Civil War in England disrupted the flow of supplies and migrants, forcing the colonists to trade with other nations, particularly the Dutch, thereby weakening the mercantilist system that Britain was attempting to enforce. This experience of independent commerce and political decision-making was a powerful precedent. When the monarchy was restored in 1660 under Charles II, the new government sought to reassert control over the colonies. This led to a series of legislative measures, including the Navigation Acts, designed to centralize trade and reinforce the mercantilist model. However, the period of neglect had created a lasting legacy. The colonies had developed their own political traditions, local elites, and economic systems. They had learned to operate independently of London, and this experience proved difficult to reverse. The seeds of self-governance and resistance to distant authority were sown during the Civil War, laying the groundwork for future conflicts over control and autonomy. The Civil War in England was, in many ways, the first true test of the empire, and its outcome was not a stronger, more unified imperial structure, but a set of colonies with a growing and increasingly confident sense of their own identity and political agency. The period of imperial neglect during the English Civil War demonstrated to the restored monarchy a critical flaw in its colonial administration, a lack of centralized control. To address this, King Charles II's government, guided by the principles of mercantilism, enacted a series of legislative measures known as the Navigation Acts. Mercantilism was the dominant economic theory of the time, positing that a nation's power was directly tied to its wealth, particularly its supply of gold and silver. To achieve this, a nation must export more than it imports, and colonies were seen as essential components of this system, serving as both sources of raw materials and captive markets for finished goods. The Navigation Acts were the primary legal mechanism by which this theory was put into practice. The first of these acts was passed by the Rump Parliament in 1651, but the most significant were those enacted after the Restoration, particularly in 1660 and 1663. The core principle of the Navigation Acts was a simple but profound one. All colonial trade had to be conducted on English or colonial ships. This was a direct attack on the Dutch, whose shipping prowess had allowed them to dominate transatlantic commerce during the period of English civil strife. The Acts aimed to eliminate Dutch competition and ensure that the profits of colonial trade remained within the British sphere. The Navigation Act of 1660 further specified that certain enumerated goods, initially tobacco, sugar, cotton, and indigo, could only be exported from the colonies to England or another English colony. These were the most valuable commodities of the empire, and this provision ensured that England had a monopoly on their purchase and resale. Colonial merchants were thus prevented from selling their products on the open market, and English merchants could buy the goods at a lower price and then sell them at a premium in Europe. The Staple Act of 1663 completed the mercantilist loop by mandating that almost all goods imported into the colonies from other European countries had to first be shipped to England, where they would be taxed, before being re-exported to the Americas. While the acts were designed to benefit the English economy, their enforcement was inconsistent. The vast distances and the inherent difficulty of policing colonial ports led to widespread smuggling and evasion, particularly in New England, where a strong merchant class had already developed. The economic impact was mixed. Southern colonies, with their staple crops, were often hurt by the restrictions on who they could sell to, while New England, with its shipbuilding industry, often benefited from the provision that ships had to be English-built. The Navigation Acts, despite their mixed results, were the first systematic attempt to define the economic relationship between Britain and its colonies, and they became a persistent source of friction and resentment that would, over a century later, contribute to the American Revolution. The English Civil War and the brief period of the Commonwealth created a unique opportunity for an aggressive and expansionist foreign policy under Oliver Cromwell. Known as the Western Design, Cromwell's plan was a grand strategic initiative to seize Spanish possessions in the Caribbean, a move intended to cripple Spain's power and solidify England's position as a major Protestant force. After a failed attempt to take the heavily fortified Spanish island of Hispaniola, the English fleet, under the command of Admiral William Penn and General Robert Venables, turned its attention to the more lightly defended island of Jamaica. In May 1655, a force of approximately 7,000 English soldiers landed on the shores of Jamaica. The Spanish defenders, a small garrison of around 1,500 soldiers and a few hundred militiamen were no match for the English army. The capital, Santiago de la Vega, fell without a major battle, and the island was formally claimed for the English crown. The conquest of Jamaica marked a significant departure from earlier English colonial ventures. It was not a settlement founded by a private company or religious dissenters, but was a direct military conquest executed by the state. This made Jamaica the first major territory to be acquired by England through outright force, a precedent that would be followed in later imperial expansion. Following the conquest, the English faced the formidable task of securing their new possession. The Spanish, though defeated, did not formally cede the island until the Treaty of Madrid in 1670. For years, Spanish guerrillas, along with their freed and escaped slaves who became known as the Maroons, waged a persistent and often successful war against the English occupiers from the island's mountainous interior. To counter this, and to address the chronic labour shortage, England began to rapidly increase its import of enslaved Africans, a policy that would make Jamaica the centre of the British slave system. To protect their new prize and to harass Spanish shipping, the English government encouraged and supported a new class of privateers and buccaneers. The port of Port Royal, strategically located on a harbour on the southern coast, became their base of operations. Figures like Sir Henry Morgan, who was later knighted for his exploits, used Port Royal as a launchpad for devastating raids on Spanish colonial towns and treasure fleets. The wealth plundered from these raids flowed into the port, turning it into one of the richest and most debauched cities in the Americas. This era of buccaneering provided a crucial, albeit lawless, layer of defense for the nascent colony and further destabilized Spanish power in the region. The conquest of Jamaica and the subsequent rise of its plantation economy cemented the Caribbean's role as the economic engine of the British Empire and introduced a new, more aggressive model of imperial acquisition. As the English crown focused on establishing colonies and securing military acquisitions, a different and highly effective model of imperial expansion emerged through the chartered company. The Hudson's Bay Company, formally incorporated by a royal charter from King Charles II in 1670, stands as the prime example of this commercial imperialism. The company's founding was the result of a proposition from two French fur traders, Pierre Esprit Radisson and Médard de Groseilliers. After being rebuffed by French authorities, they proposed to English interests that the most efficient way to access the rich fur-bearing lands of North America was not overland through the St. Lawrence, but directly via Hudson Bay, a route that would bypass French territory. The charter granted to the company was an extraordinary document. It gave the HBC a monopoly over all trade in the entire drainage basin of Hudson Bay, an immense and vaguely defined territory that came to be known as Rupert's Land. This was not a typical trading patent. It also vested the company with the authority to govern, legislate, administer justice, and wage war in this vast dominion, effectively making it a semi-sovereign entity. The company's model was distinct from the American settlement colonies. Rather than encouraging mass migration and agricultural development, the HBC established a network of fortified trading posts, or factories, on the shores of the bay. The company's strategy was to have Native American trappers, primarily from the Cree and Assiniboine nations, bring their furs to these posts. This inverted the traditional colonial dynamic, as the company waited for commerce to come to it, rather than pushing aggressively into the interior. The company's early years were marked by intense and persistent rivalry with French fur traders, particularly the Coureurs des Bois and the later Northwest Company. The French, with their network of inland posts and strong relationships with Native American allies, posed a direct threat to the HBC's monopoly. This commercial competition was a proxy for the larger Anglo-French struggle for control of North America, with both sides raiding each other's forts and manipulating native alliances. These conflicts culminated in the late 17th century with a series of battles for control of the bay, a period of open warfare that was a direct extension of European conflicts. The Hudson's Bay Company's success was immense. Driven by the insatiable European demand for beaver pelts, which were essential for felt hats, the company's profits, managed by a small board of directors in London, were staggering. The HBC became a powerful economic force and a key component of Britain's mercantile system. It was a model of imperial power projection that relied on a single resource, a limited number of permanent employees, and an extensive network of indigenous partnerships. Its legacy is a commercial and administrative footprint that would shape the geography and politics of a vast portion of North America for centuries, demonstrating a powerful and unique form of imperial control. Following the consolidation of royal power and the reassertion of a mercantilist economic policy, England turned its attention to its primary commercial rival, the Dutch Republic. The three Anglo-Dutch Wars, fought between 1652 and 1674, were not conflicts over territory, but a fierce struggle for maritime and commercial supremacy. The Dutch, with their massive merchant fleet, superior shipbuilding technology, and sophisticated financial institutions, had eclipsed England as the dominant trading power in the world. They were a direct threat to England's newly enacted Navigation Acts, which sought to restrict trade to English ships. These wars were, in essence, a battle for the soul of the burgeoning global economy. The First Anglo-Dutch War, 1652–1654, began over English enforcement of the Navigation Act of 1651, which required all goods imported into England to be carried on English ships. The war was primarily fought at sea, with large-scale fleet engagements in the English Channel and the North Sea. Despite some initial English successes, the war ended in a stalemate. The Treaty of Westminster in 1654 saw the Dutch reluctantly recognise the Navigation Act, but the underlying commercial tensions remained unresolved. The Second Anglo-Dutch War, 1665–1667, was a more decisive and brutal conflict. It was fueled by renewed colonial and commercial rivalries in Africa, the Americas, and Asia. In the Americas, English forces under Colonel Richard Nicolls seized the Dutch colony of New Netherland in 1664. The principal settlement, New Amsterdam, was renamed New York in honor of the Duke of York, the future King James II, who had ordered the conquest. This was a critical strategic victory, as it eliminated the wedge of Dutch territory that had separated England's New England colonies from those in the south, and provided a valuable deep-water port. The war at sea, however, was less clear-cut for the English. The Dutch fleet, commanded by the brilliant Admiral Michiel de Ruyter, inflicted a devastating defeat on the English in the Battle of the 4 Days, and most famously sailed up the Medway River in 1667, burning and capturing English warships in their home port. The Treaty of Breda, which ended the war, was a compromise. The English kept New York, but the Dutch retained their control of the valuable spice island of Suriname. The Third Anglo-Dutch War, 1672–1674, was a much larger European conflict, with England and France allied against the Dutch Republic. While the war was a disaster for the English, who were defeated at sea and saw their French allies grow in power, it ultimately cemented English control over New York. The Treaty of Westminster in 1674 officially confirmed the exchange of New York for Suriname. The Anglo-Dutch Wars, while costly and at times humiliating for England, forced it to professionalize its navy, leading to permanent institutional reforms in shipbuilding and naval command. The wars ended with England having secured its place as the preeminent naval power and a major colonial force. having acquired the key territory of New York that would unify its North American empire. Following the consolidation of its North American territories, the English crown under Charles II granted a massive land charter in 1663 to 8 of his political allies, known as the Lords Proprietors. This vast tract of land, named Carolina in honor of the king, stretched from the southern border of the Virginia colony to Spanish Florida and west to the Pacific. The proprietors' primary goal was to create a profitable colony, and they sought to do so by attracting settlers with generous land grants and a promise of religious tolerance, a strategy designed to appeal to a wide array of English and European migrants. Initial settlement attempts were slow and often failed. The first permanent settlement, Charlestown, modern-day Charleston, was not established until 1670. The colony's early economic ventures, including lumber, naval stores, and cattle ranching, were only moderately successful. The true economic engine of the colony was discovered later in the 1690s, with the introduction of rice cultivation. The introduction of rice to the Carolina Lowcountry, possibly by enslaved Africans from West Africa, proved to be a pivotal development. The marshy, subtropical environment was perfectly suited for growing a crop that was in high demand in Europe. Rice cultivation was a highly labor-intensive process, demanding extensive engineering to create the sophisticated systems of dikes, dams, and floodgates necessary to flood and drain the fields. This led to an immediate and massive increase in the demand for enslaved labor. By the early 18th century, Carolina had become a slave society, with a population ratio where enslaved Africans outnumbered European settlers. The population of enslaved people from the rice-growing regions of West Africa brought with them invaluable agricultural knowledge, which was essential for the success of the plantations. The immense wealth generated by rice transformed the Carolina Lowcountry into one of the richest regions in British North America, and the white planter class into a powerful political and economic elite. The colony's geography and economic development led to a unique social and political hierarchy. The wealthy, concentrated in the Lowcountry, created a society based on large-scale plantation agriculture and chattel slavery. The northern part of the colony, which had fewer navigable rivers and a different geography, attracted a more modest population of yeoman farmers from Virginia. This social and economic division led to the formal separation of the territory into two distinct royal colonies, North Carolina and South Carolina, in 1729. The Carolina colonies were a critical component of the empire's southern tier, representing a highly successful, albeit brutal, model of a plantation society built on a single, labor-intensive commodity and a rigid racial hierarchy. In contrast to the commercial and agrarian motivations of the southern colonies, the New England settlements were shaped by a rigid Puritan religious orthodoxy. The Salem witch trials of 1692 stand as a dramatic and tragic example of the complexities of this colonial society. The events were not an isolated incident, but a culmination of a century of religious, political, and social anxieties in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The colony's charter had been revoked in 1684, and the new royal government was widely distrusted. This political instability, combined with ongoing warfare with Native American tribes on the frontier and a recent smallpox epidemic, created a climate of fear and uncertainty. The trials began in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris, where his daughter and niece began to exhibit strange behaviors, including fits and uncontrollable screaming. The local doctor, unable to find a physical cause, attributed their afflictions to witchcraft. Under pressure, the girls accused several local women, including Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean, and two poor and elderly women, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. The accusations soon spread beyond the initial group, leading to the arrest of over 150 individuals in Salem and the surrounding communities. The legal proceedings were a profound departure from English law. The court, convened by Governor William Phips, accepted spectral evidence, the testimony of the afflicted girls, that they had seen the accused's spirit tormenting them. This form of evidence, which could not be corroborated or cross-examined, led to a cascade of further accusations. The accused were often social outcasts or individuals who had challenged the patriarchal religious authority of the Puritan community. Those who confessed were generally spared execution, as their confession was seen as a sign of repentance. However, those who maintained their innocence were often subjected to immense pressure, and their refusal to confess was interpreted as a sign of their evil. The trials led to the execution of 19 people by hanging, with one man, Giles Corey, pressed to death for refusing to enter a plea. The social and legal structure of the colony began to buckle under the strain of the accusations. As prominent and well-respected members of society were accused, and as the credibility of the afflicted girls came into question, key figures in the colony, including Reverend Increase Mather and his son Cotton Mather, began to argue against the use of spectral evidence. In October 1692, Governor Phips dissolved the court and replaced it with a new one that prohibited spectral evidence. The remaining prisoners were eventually released. The Salem witch trials stand as a dark chapter in colonial history, a cautionary tale of how religious fanaticism, social hysteria, and a flawed legal system can lead to injustice and tragedy. The early 18th century was a period of intense imperial competition, primarily between Great Britain, France, and Spain. This rivalry culminated in the War of the Spanish Succession 1701–1714, a conflict fought across Europe and its colonies to prevent a unified Franco-Spanish monarchy. Great Britain, allied with the Dutch Republic and the Holy Roman Empire, emerged from the war as a major European power, a status officially recognized by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. This peace settlement was not a single document, but a series of individual treaties signed between the various combatants. For the British Empire, it represented a pivotal moment as it redrew the map of its territories and established the foundation for its global supremacy. The terms of the Treaty of Utrecht were highly favourable to Great Britain, granting it significant territorial and commercial concessions from both France and Spain. From France, Britain acquired several key North American territories. The entire territory of Newfoundland, a crucial base for the valuable cod fishing industry, was formally ceded to the British. In addition, France gave up its claims to the Hudson Bay region and the Acadia Territory, which was renamed Nova Scotia. These acquisitions not only solidified Britain's control over the northern part of North America, but also confined the French to the St. Lawrence River Valley, a strategic victory that would shape future conflicts. The concessions from Spain were equally significant. Britain was granted the right to establish a naval base on the Strait of Gibraltar, a small but strategically vital possession that gave Britain control over the entry and exit of the Mediterranean Sea. This was a critical military and commercial asset that remains a British territory to this day. The treaty also granted Britain a monopoly known as the Asiento de Negros, or the slave contract, which gave the South Sea Company the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to the Spanish colonies for a period of 30 years. This commercial right was a source of immense profit and a major component of Britain's expansion of its transatlantic slave trade. The Treaty of Utrecht's importance cannot be overstated. It officially confirmed Britain's status as a dominant European power and a major player on the world stage. It consolidated key strategic territories in North America and gave Britain a permanent naval presence in the Mediterranean. Furthermore, the commercial rights it secured provided a powerful economic boost to Britain's mercantile empire. The treaty did not end the imperial rivalries, but it placed Britain in a position of strength from which it could compete with and eventually surpass its rivals for a century of continued imperial expansion and conflict. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, while establishing a new balance of power, did not eliminate the underlying imperial rivalries between Great Britain and Spain. Tensions persisted throughout the early 18th century, primarily over two key issues: the British trading monopoly known as the Asiento de Negros and the illegal smuggling trade. While the treaty granted the British South Sea Company the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies, it also permitted a single annual trading ship, the Navio de Permiso, to operate in the region. This legal trade was widely abused by British merchants, who used the annual ship as a cover for a massive illegal smuggling operation that flooded Spanish colonial markets with British goods. Spain, in an effort to protect its own commercial interests, authorized its Coast Guard, or guarda-costas, to board and search British vessels in the Caribbean. These searches were a constant source of friction, leading to frequent confrontations and accusations of brutality. The incident that gave the war its memorable name occurred in 1731, when Captain Robert Jenkins of the merchant ship Rebecca was stopped by a Spanish guarda-costas vessel. In a dispute over a supposed smuggling violation, a Spanish captain allegedly cut off Jenkins's ear. Jenkins, holding his severed ear in a jar of spirits, brought his case before the House of Commons in 1738, where he presented his ear as proof of Spanish aggression. While the story was likely embellished for political effect, it served as a powerful symbol of national honor and a rallying cry for the British public and the mercantile class, who were eager for a war to expand their trade and weaken their Spanish rivals. Despite the initial reluctance of Prime Minister Robert Walpole, who favoured a policy of peace, public and parliamentary pressure for a military response became irresistible. The War of Jenkins's Ear officially began in 1739. The conflict was primarily a naval and colonial war, fought in the Caribbean and the Americas. The British fleet, under the command of Admiral Edward Vernon, achieved a notable victory in 1739 with the capture of the Spanish port of Portobello in Panama. This was a major strategic and morale-boosting success. However, subsequent campaigns were far less successful. The massive British amphibious assault on the fortified Spanish port of Cartagena in 1741, a campaign involving over 180 ships and 23,000 men, ended in a disastrous defeat. This failure, combined with a severe yellow fever outbreak, led to heavy British casualties and a significant loss of naval and military prestige. The War of Jenkins's Ear, while inconclusive on its own, soon became absorbed into the larger War of the Austrian Succession in 1742. It serves as a crucial prelude to a century of global conflict. The war demonstrated Britain's willingness to use military force to protect and expand its commercial interests, even in distant colonial theatres. It revealed the enduring imperial rivalries with Spain and France, and it exposed the strategic vulnerabilities of both sides in the New World. While no decisive victory was won, the conflict hardened Britain's resolve to secure its dominance in the Americas and set the stage for the wider struggle that would ultimately decide the fate of both continents. The founding of Georgia in 1732 stands out as a unique venture among the 13 colonies. Rooted in philanthropic and strategic motives rather than purely commercial ones, the colony was the brainchild of James Oglethorpe, a member of Parliament and a social reformer deeply concerned with the plight of imprisoned debtors in England. His vision was to create a haven where these debtors and other worthy poor could start a new life, free from the crushing poverty and social stigma they faced at home. Oglethorpe and his fellow trustees received a charter from King George II, for whom the colony was named, to establish a settlement that would be a social experiment in civic virtue. The second, and equally important, purpose for Georgia's founding was strategic. The colony was designed to serve as a military buffer zone between the wealthy British plantation colony of South Carolina and the Spanish territory of Florida. Spanish forces in St. Augustine posed a constant threat to British colonial interests, and a new, well-defended settlement would serve as a crucial line of defense. This dual purpose shaped the colony's early policies. The trustees imposed strict regulations, including a ban on rum and, most significantly, a prohibition on slavery. Oglethorpe and the trustees believed that a colony of small, independent farmers would be more militarily effective against the Spanish than a society built on large-scale plantations and enslaved labor. The initial settlement of Savannah was established in 1733, and Oglethorpe's leadership proved instrumental in the colony's early survival. He was a skilled negotiator, forging a crucial alliance with the Yamacraw chief Tomochichi, who granted the colonists land and acted as a vital intermediary with other Native American groups. Despite this, the colony struggled to achieve economic self-sufficiency. The original settlers, many of whom had no farming experience, found it difficult to cultivate crops in the new environment. The prohibition on slavery, while a noble social experiment, put Georgia at a significant economic disadvantage compared to its neighbors. Landholders in the colony repeatedly petitioned the trustees to lift the ban on slavery, arguing that they could not compete with the profitable rice and indigo plantations of South Carolina. The trustees' social experiment ultimately failed to take root. By 1750, facing a stagnant economy and mounting pressure from the colonists, the trustees lifted the ban on slavery. 3 years later, in 1753, they surrendered their charter to the Crown, and Georgia became a royal colony. The royal government quickly adopted the plantation model of its southern neighbors, and a slave society developed rapidly. The founding of Georgia, while initially driven by a utopian vision, ultimately succumbed to the economic realities of the colonial South, becoming the last of the 13 colonies to join the ranks of the British Empire's plantation economy. Following the establishment of its trading factories in India, the East India Company spent much of the 17th century focused on commerce, operating under the patronage of the powerful Mughal Empire. However, the political landscape of the subcontinent began to shift dramatically in the early 18th century, a change that would fundamentally alter the company's role from a mercantile entity to a political and military power. The death of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707 marked the beginning of the empire's decline. As central authority weakened, various regional powers, including the Nawabs of Bengal and Hyderabad, began to assert their independence. The most significant of these emerging forces was the Maratha Confederacy. The Marathas, originating from the Deccan Plateau, rose to prominence under the leadership of their founder, Shivaji. They were a powerful military force, skilled in guerrilla warfare and cavalry tactics, who successfully challenged Mughal rule. Following Aurangzeb's death, the Maratha influence expanded rapidly, and by the 1740s, they had become the dominant military power in a vast portion of western and central India. The Maratha incursions into coastal regions, including those near the British trading factories, created a period of profound instability and a direct threat to the company's commercial interests. The East India Company, which had previously relied on the stability provided by the Mughal administration, now found itself in a new, more dangerous environment. To protect its trading posts and assets, the company began to professionalize its military forces. It raised armies of Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, and hired British officers to train them in European military discipline and tactics. The company's forts, such as Fort William in Calcutta and Fort St. George in Madras, became not just warehouses for goods, but armed strongholds. These military preparations, initially for self-defense, would later be used for territorial expansion. The British were not alone in this struggle. They were in direct competition with the French East India Company. During the War of the Austrian Succession in Europe, a parallel conflict known as the First Carnatic War, 1746–1048, erupted in India. The French, under the leadership of Governor Joseph-François Dupleix, achieved a notable victory with the capture of Madras, a major British trading factory. The war was ultimately indecisive and ended with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which returned Madras to the British. However, it was a crucial learning experience. It demonstrated that European military technology and discipline could be decisive in India, and, most importantly, that a small, well-trained sepoy army could defeat a far larger Indian force. This realization would lead the company to abandon its purely commercial role and embrace a strategy of political and military intervention, setting the stage for the century of conquest that would follow. The East India Company's transition from a trading entity to a territorial power brought with it immense wealth, but also a new set of responsibilities that it was ill-equipped and often unwilling to manage. This failure was most catastrophically demonstrated by the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, a human disaster that exposed the brutal consequences of colonial exploitation and administrative neglect. Following the decisive British victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company effectively became the de facto ruler of Bengal, one of the most populous and fertile regions of the subcontinent. The company was granted the Diwani, or the right to collect land revenue, in 1765. This gave it complete control over Bengal's taxation system, a power it wielded not for governance, but for profit. The company's primary objective was to maximize its revenue extraction, to fund its wars and pay its shareholders. This led to a drastic increase in land taxes, often by as much as 50%, with no consideration for the traditional rhythms of agricultural life. The company, through its Indian tax collectors, or zamindars, enforced these collections with great severity, punishing farmers who could not pay with beatings and torture. This extractive policy, combined with a period of severe drought that began in 1769, created the perfect conditions for a devastating famine. The company's mismanagement exacerbated the natural disaster into a full-blown humanitarian catastrophe. As the famine took hold, the price of grain soared. Rather than providing relief, the company's agents and Indian speculators, many of whom were connected to the company, hoarded food stocks, creating a black market and artificially inflating prices. The company's policy of forcing farmers to cultivate cash crops like indigo and opium, which were essential for its trade with China, over food crops further reduced the available food supply. A government-appointed council that was formed to address the famine with both British and Bengali members was largely ineffective due to internal corruption and a lack of real authority. The company's governor of Bengal at the time, Richard Besher, openly acknowledged the suffering but did little to intervene, prioritizing revenue collection over the lives of the Bengali population. The human toll of the famine was staggering. Historians estimate that approximately 10 million people, or a third of Bengal's population, perished. The countryside was depopulated and the agrarian economy was ruined, leading to a collapse in the very land revenue the company had so ruthlessly pursued. The famine was a pivotal event in the history of the East India Company and the British Empire. It exposed the moral and administrative bankruptcy of a commercial enterprise attempting to govern a vast and complex territory. The disaster led to widespread condemnation in Britain and initiated a public debate that would eventually result in greater parliamentary oversight of the company's affairs. The famine stands as a brutal reminder that the pursuit of colonial profit, when unchecked, could lead to unparalleled human suffering. The political development of the British North American colonies followed a trajectory distinct from the Crown-led acquisitions in the Caribbean and the commercial enterprises in India. From their earliest days, the colonies developed representative governing bodies, known as assemblies, which were a crucial component of their political evolution and the foundation of a distinct American identity. The precedent for these assemblies was set in Virginia in 1619, with the establishment of the House of Burgesses, the first elected legislative body in the Americas. This was not an act of radical democracy, but a pragmatic decision by the Virginia Company to attract more settlers by granting them a voice in local governance. Over the course of the 17th century, almost every British colony developed its own bicameral legislature. These bodies typically consisted of a governor, appointed by the Crown or the proprietor, and two houses, an upper house or council, whose members were also appointed, and a lower house or assembly, whose members were elected by property-owning male colonists. The lower house was the most powerful of these bodies. It held the critical authority to initiate all legislation, including money bills, which gave it a potent check on the power of the appointed governor and the council. This power of the purse was the most important political tool of the colonial assemblies. The assemblies were far from democratic in a modern sense. Voting rights were restricted to a small percentage of the male population, primarily wealthy landowners, and the vast majority of the population, women, enslaved Africans, and the landless poor, were excluded. However, within these limitations, the assemblies became a robust and confident force in colonial politics. They were a forum for local elites to discuss and legislate on issues of taxation, infrastructure, land distribution, and militia defense. This constant practice of self-governance fostered a political culture of independence and a sense of shared political identity. Throughout the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the colonial assemblies gradually expanded their power, often at the expense of the royal governors. The governors, who were dependent on the assemblies for their salaries and for the funding of colonial projects, often found themselves in a difficult position. This tension created a recurring pattern of political conflict between local interests and imperial authority. The colonists increasingly saw their elected assemblies as legitimate representatives of their interests, while the royal government in London viewed them with suspicion and as a challenge to imperial control. This political experience of self-governance, which developed over a century and a half, would be a foundational element in the coming conflicts with Great Britain. The assemblies, which had begun as a pragmatic tool for attracting settlers, had evolved into a powerful expression of a distinct American political identity, one that was increasingly at odds with the centralized authority of the British Empire. By the mid-18th century, the long-standing imperial rivalry between Great Britain and France reached a new and decisive stage. The conflict, known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, was a global struggle, but its North American theatre, the French and Indian War, 1754–1763, would determine the ultimate fate of the continent. The central point of contention was the Ohio River Valley, a vast and fertile territory claimed by both empires. The French sought to control the region to connect their settlements in Canada with those in the Mississippi Valley, while the British, whose colonial population was expanding westward, saw it as a vital area for fur trade and future settlement. The war began in 1754 with a skirmish involving a young Virginia militiaman named George Washington, whose forces attacked a small French post. This incident quickly escalated, and the first years of the war were a series of devastating setbacks for the British. The French, with their strong alliances with Native American tribes, particularly the Huron and Algonquin, were able to use guerrilla tactics to great effect against the more rigid British and colonial forces. A major defeat occurred in 1755 when a British expedition led by General Edward Braddock was ambushed and routed near Fort Duquesne, a key French stronghold at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. The British were also on the defensive in the north, losing forts and suffering from raids on their frontier settlements. The tide of the war began to turn in 1757 with the appointment of William Pitt as Britain's new Prime Minister. Pitt, who saw the North American theatre as the most critical front, implemented a new, more aggressive strategy. He poured vast resources into the war effort, sending large numbers of regular British troops to the colonies and promising to reimburse the colonial assemblies for their expenses, a move that secured their vital cooperation. Pitt's strategy focused on a direct assault on the French centres of power, Fort Duquesne, Louisbourg, and Quebec. The British campaigns were a series of methodical, well-executed military operations. In 1758, the British captured Louisbourg, a heavily fortified French port that guarded the St. Lawrence River. The following year, British forces finally captured Fort Duquesne, renaming it Fort Pitt. The most decisive moment, however, would come with the siege of Quebec. The British, under General James Wolfe, laid siege to the city for months. The ultimate victory at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in 1759 led to the fall of Quebec, a pivotal strategic loss for France. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which gave Great Britain all of French Canada, all French territory east of the Mississippi River, and Spanish Florida. The French and Indian War not only solidified Britain's dominance in North America, but also set the stage for a new era of imperial administration, and eventually a new conflict with its own colonies. The climax of the French and Indian War, and a pivotal moment in the history of British North America, was the siege and capture of Quebec in 1759. This campaign was the linchpin of William Pitt's strategy to eliminate French power on the continent. The British forces, commanded by Major General James Wolfe, arrived on the St. Lawrence River in late June and began a prolonged siege of the city, which was the political and military centre of New France. Quebec's formidable defences were its greatest strength. The city sat on a bluff high above the river, protected by steep cliffs and a network of forts and batteries. The French forces, led by the Marquis de Montcalm, were positioned to defend this strategic high ground, making a direct assault virtually impossible. For months, the British maintained a naval blockade of the city, bombarding it from the river and harassing the French defences, but they could not force a decisive battle. As summer turned to autumn, Wolfe's window for a successful siege was closing. A winter in Canada would force the British fleet to retreat, leaving the army in a precarious position. Desperate for a victory, Wolfe devised a high-risk, daring plan to surprise the French. He planned a nighttime landing at a location known as Anse-au-Foulon, a steep, narrow path on the cliffs less than 2 miles west of the city. The path was lightly guarded by the French, who believed the terrain to be impassable for a large military force. In the early morning hours of September 13th, 1759, British troops successfully scaled the cliffs and rapidly assembled on the Plains of Abraham, an open field just outside the city walls. Montcalm, astonished to find a British army in his rear, made a critical error. Rather than waiting for reinforcements from his various outposts, he chose to engage the British immediately, believing his well-trained regular army and militiamen could defeat them in open combat. Montcalm's army consisted of a mix of French regular troops, colonial militiamen, and Native American allies, totaling around 4,500 men. The British forces, though slightly smaller at 4,800, were a highly disciplined and professional force. The battle itself was remarkably short, lasting less than 30 minutes. The British, formed in a long, thin red line, held their fire until the French were within 40 yards, unleashing a devastating volley that broke the French advance. The subsequent British bayonet charge and the retreat of the French forces turned the tide. Both General Wolfe and General Montcalm were mortally wounded during the battle. The fall of Quebec was a pivotal strategic loss for France, and its surrender 5 days later marked the beginning of the end of New France. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham was not the end of the war, but it was the decisive victory that led directly to the British conquest of Canada and the reshaping of the North American continent. The 7 Years' War, a global conflict fought across Europe, the Americas, India, and Africa, concluded with a series of peace treaties that fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical map of the world. The most significant of these was the Treaty of Paris, signed on February 10th, 1763, between Great Britain, France, and Spain. This treaty, which formally ended the French and Indian War in North America, represented the high water mark of British imperial success in the 18th century and marked the beginning of a period of undisputed British dominance in the New World. The terms of the treaty were a culmination of British military victories and the ambitious strategic vision of Prime Minister William Pitt. From France, the terms were devastating. Great Britain received all of France's North American possessions east of the Mississippi River, with the exception of New Orleans. This vast territory included all of French Canada, the Great Lakes region, and the Ohio River Valley, the very land that had been the primary cause of the conflict. France was left with only a few minor islands in the Caribbean and a handful of trading posts in India. To compensate its ally Spain for the loss of Florida to Britain, France ceded its remaining territory west of the Mississippi River, an immense but sparsely populated region known as Louisiana. This single act effectively removed France as a major colonial power in North America. From Spain, Britain received Spanish Florida, which further solidified Britain's control over the eastern seaboard of North America. In exchange for Havana and Manila, which the British had captured during the war, Spain received back its other key possessions. The treaty also confirmed Great Britain's acquisition of Grenada and other Caribbean islands from France, which were vital for the profitable sugar trade. The Treaty of Paris was a monumental achievement for the British Empire. It gave Britain control of a contiguous empire stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River and from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico. The North American colonies were no longer hemmed in by French territory, a strategic victory that removed the most significant external threat they had faced. The treaty's provisions also had a profound impact on the Native American tribes of the Ohio River Valley, who were not consulted in the peace negotiations and now found their lands under British, not French, control. The French had cultivated strong alliances with these tribes through the fur trade, but the new British administration saw them as obstacles to westward expansion. The treaty's outcome set the stage for future conflicts with Native American peoples, as well as new administrative challenges for the British government. The scale of the new empire, while a testament to British military and naval power, would prove immensely difficult to manage, and the debts incurred to win the war would become a central cause of the coming revolution. The British victory in the 7 Years' War, while monumental, created an immediate and profound set of challenges for imperial administration. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 left Great Britain with a vastly expanded empire, but also a massive national debt. The war had been a costly global conflict, and the British government had borrowed heavily to finance its military campaigns. The national debt had nearly doubled, placing immense pressure on Parliament to find new sources of revenue. This financial crisis was the most immediate consequence of the war and the primary driver of subsequent imperial policies. To address this debt and to manage the new territories, the British government faced two critical challenges. The first was the administration of the newly acquired lands and peoples in North America. The vast territory gained from France included not only Canada, but also the Ohio River Valley, a region populated by numerous Native American tribes who had been allied with the French. These tribes were not consulted in the peace treaty and viewed the British as hostile occupiers. This hostility culminated in Pontiac's War, 1763,000–1766. a widespread Native American rebellion that required a significant and costly military response. The British government, seeking to prevent further conflict and contain the costs of a permanent military presence, issued the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. This policy, while intended to maintain peace, was deeply resented by land-hungry American colonists who saw it as an infringement on their rights. The second challenge was how to integrate the new territories into the existing imperial structure and ensure they paid for their own defense. The British government believed that the American colonies, which had benefited most from the war, should contribute to the cost of their protection. Before the war, the colonies had been largely self-governing and lightly taxed by the home government. Now, Parliament sought to centralise authority and impose a new system of revenue generation. This led to a series of legislative measures, beginning with the Sugar Act of 1764, which was a direct attempt to raise revenue from the colonies rather than just regulate trade. The post-war period was thus marked by a fundamental change in the relationship between Great Britain and its colonies. The era of salutary neglect was over, replaced by a new imperial policy of direct administration, centralization, and revenue extraction. The British government focused on the financial and logistical realities of its new empire, failed to appreciate the political traditions of self-governance that had developed in the colonies over a century and a half. The colonists, who had fought and bled in the war and had a strong sense of their own political rights, viewed these new measures as a violation of their liberties. This clash of imperial priorities and colonial expectations would, in less than a decade, escalate into open rebellion. The British victory in the 7 Years' War, while granting a vast new territory in North America, also created an immediate and costly crisis on the western frontier. With the French removed from the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes region, a number of Native American tribes, including the Ottawa, Huron, and Potawatomi, feared a massive influx of Anglo-American settlers onto their lands. These tribes, who had previously been allied with the French, viewed the British not as liberators, but as hostile occupiers. This hostility was compounded by the British government's new policies, which cut off the traditional French diplomatic gifts and trade in ammunition. The growing discontent culminated in a widespread and coordinated rebellion known as Pontiac's War in 1763. Led by the Ottawa chief Pontiac, the rebellion saw a series of attacks on British forts and settlements along the frontier. Native American forces captured 8 out of 10 British forts in the Ohio and Great Lakes regions, causing significant military and civilian casualties. The rebellion demonstrated to the British government that a permanent and expensive military presence would be required to secure the western lands and protect colonial settlers. The British, still reeling from the immense debt incurred during the 7 Years' War, were eager to find a cheaper and more peaceful solution to the frontier crisis. The British response was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This landmark document had 2 primary objectives: to contain the costs of a permanent military presence and to prevent further conflict with Native American tribes. The proclamation established a boundary line, known as the Proclamation Line, that followed the Appalachian Mountains from north to south. It forbade all colonial settlement west of this line and mandated that any future land purchases in the area could only be made by the Crown, not by individual colonists or land companies. The vast new territories acquired from France were officially designated as a Great Indian Reserve. While the Proclamation of 1763 was intended to be a temporary measure to stabilize the frontier, it was met with immediate and fierce opposition from the American colonists. The Proclamation Line was seen as a direct and unjust infringement on their rights as British subjects. Land-hungry colonists, many of whom had fought in the 7 Years' War, with the expectation of westward expansion, were infuriated by the government's decision to deny them access to the fertile lands of the Ohio Valley. Land speculators, including prominent colonial figures like George Washington, who had already invested heavily in western lands, saw their claims and potential profits threatened. The proclamation thus became a significant source of colonial discontent, creating a deep-seated resentment against the British government and its new imperial policies. Following the costly victory in the 7 Years' War, the British government faced a new reality: a vast North American empire with a massive war debt. The British national debt had risen from 75 million in 1754 to 133 million by 1763, a financial crisis that demanded a solution. The British Parliament, led by Prime Minister George Grenville, determined that the American colonies, which had benefited most from the war and were lightly taxed in comparison to their counterparts in Britain, should contribute to the cost of their own defence and administration. This new imperial policy of direct revenue extraction marked a fundamental shift from the previous system of salutary neglect and trade regulation. The first major piece of this new legislation was the Sugar Act of 1764. This act was not a new tax, but a modification of the earlier Molasses Act of 1733, which had placed a prohibitive duty on foreign molasses imported into the colonies. The Molasses Act had been widely ignored through smuggling. The Sugar Act, in contrast, lowered the tax on molasses to a more moderate level, but introduced strict new enforcement measures. It gave British naval vessels the authority to search ships without a warrant, and established special vice-admiralty courts in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where trials were conducted without a jury. The intent was to make the tax enforceable and, most importantly, to raise revenue for the Crown. While the Sugar Act was a commercial tax, its purpose was unmistakably to raise revenue, a new and alarming precedent for the colonists. The reaction to the Sugar Act was a mix of economic hardship and a growing sense of political grievance. Merchants and distillers in New England, who relied on molasses for rum production, were particularly affected. The most significant opposition, however, came from the philosophical and legal principles it challenged. The colonists argued that the act was an unconstitutional tax because they had not given their consent to it. This was the first articulation of the principle of no taxation without representation, which would become the central rallying cry of the revolutionary movement. The colonists believed that only their own colonial assemblies, in which they had elected representatives, had the right to tax them. Parliament's second major legislative action, the Stamp Act of 1765, was a more direct and more explosive measure. It required that a tax stamp be placed on almost all printed materials, including legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, and pamphlets. Unlike the Sugar Act, which was a commercial tax on a specific product, the Stamp Act was a direct tax on all colonists, regardless of their economic status. This was seen as a blatant violation of their rights as Englishmen. The colonies responded with a wave of organized protests, boycotts, and mob violence. The Stamp Act Congress, convened in New York in 1765, brought together representatives from 9 colonies to formally protest the tax. The act was eventually repealed in 1766, but the British Parliament simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its absolute authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The events surrounding these two acts marked the beginning of a decade of escalating tensions and the awakening of a revolutionary consciousness in the colonies. The British Parliament's passage of the Stamp Act in 1765 provoked a more widespread and coordinated colonial response than any previous imperial legislation. While political elites in the colonial assemblies protested the tax through formal petitions and resolutions, a more radical form of resistance emerged from the streets in the form of secret societies known as the Sons of Liberty. These groups, composed of merchants, artisans, and laborers, were instrumental in mobilizing public opinion and organizing direct action protests against British tax policies. The Sons of Liberty were not a single unified organization, but a network of autonomous chapters that operated in all 13 colonies, with their greatest strength in major cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The first major act of defiance occurred in Boston, where the local Sons of Liberty chapter, led by men like Samuel Adams and James Otis, orchestrated a series of violent demonstrations. On August 14, 1765, an effigy of Andrew Oliver, the appointed stamp distributor for Massachusetts, was hung from a tree which came to be known as the Liberty Tree. A mob later ransacked and destroyed Oliver's office and his home, forcing him to resign his commission. Similar acts of intimidation and violence against stamp distributors and royal officials were repeated throughout the colonies, effectively preventing the Stamp Act from being enforced. The Sons of Liberty used a combination of intimidation and mob action to make it clear that anyone who attempted to enforce the tax would face severe consequences. In New York, the Sons of Liberty, with leaders such as Alexander McDougall and Isaac Sears, were equally effective. They organized large-scale demonstrations, and through their pressure, the appointed stamp distributor was forced to resign before any stamps could be distributed. In Connecticut, a merchant named Jared Ingersoll was intercepted by a mob of Sons of Liberty on his way to Hartford and forced to resign. This coordinated campaign of intimidation was remarkably successful, and by the end of 1765, not a single stamp distributor remained in office in any of the colonies. The Sons of Liberty had, through their actions, rendered the Stamp Act unenforceable, a fact that was not lost on the British Parliament. The Sons of Liberty also played a crucial role in organizing economic resistance. They were a driving force behind the non-importation agreements, which were voluntary boycotts of British goods. These boycotts were a powerful economic weapon as they put pressure on British merchants and manufacturers who, in turn, petitioned Parliament for the repeal of the Stamp Act. The organized resistance of the Sons of Liberty demonstrated a new level of political consciousness and coordination among the American colonists. Their actions showed that a radical and committed minority could use public demonstrations and economic boycotts to challenge the authority of the British Empire and, in the process, provide a crucial new model of popular resistance that would be employed throughout the coming conflicts. The British Parliament's repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766 was a temporary victory for the American colonists, but it did not signify a change in British imperial policy. Accompanying the repeal was the Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's absolute authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This statement of principle set the stage for the next round of imperial taxation and colonial protest. The first of these new measures was the Quartering Act of 1765, which, though largely a logistical matter, became a significant point of contention. The act required colonial assemblies to provide housing and provisions, such as food, drink, and fuel, for British soldiers stationed in their colonies. While its primary purpose was to reduce the cost of maintaining a military presence in North America, many colonists viewed it as a direct threat to their civil liberties and a standing army in peacetime. The New York Assembly, in particular, refused to fully comply, leading to its suspension by Parliament in 1767. This demonstrated to the colonists that Parliament was willing to use its authority to coerce them into obedience. The most significant and incendiary imperial measures, however, were the Townshend Acts of 1767, proposed by Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend. These were not a single act, but a series of 5 separate legislative measures designed to raise revenue and assert British control. The most important of these was the Revenue Act of 1767, which placed new duties on glass, lead, paper, tea, and paint imported into the colonies. Unlike the Stamp Act, which was a direct tax, these were external taxes on trade, a distinction that Townshend believed the colonists would accept. However, the colonists saw no difference in principle. They believed Parliament had no right to tax them for the purpose of raising revenue without their consent. The Townshend Acts also contained provisions that further inflamed colonial tensions. They created a new Board of Customs Commissioners in Boston to more rigorously enforce trade regulations and combat smuggling, which had been rampant during the period of salutary neglect. They also authorized the use of writs of assistance, which were general search warrants that allowed customs officials to search colonial ships and homes for smuggled goods without a specific cause. The colonists viewed these writs as a violation of their rights as Englishmen, which protected them from unreasonable search and seizure. The colonial response to the Townshend Acts was widespread and organized. Merchants in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, led by groups like the Sons of Liberty, organized a new set of non-importation agreements, boycotting the taxed British goods. This economic resistance was a powerful tool, as it put pressure on British merchants to lobby Parliament for the repeal of the Acts. The colonial assemblies also issued circular letters, with Samuel Adams's Massachusetts circular letter being the most famous, which called for a unified colonial opposition. The British government, seeing this as sedition, ordered the assemblies to rescind the letters, which they refused to do. This led to a further escalation of tensions, with British troops being sent to occupy Boston in 1768 to restore order. The Townshend Acts and the ensuing protests widened the gulf between the British government and its American colonies, bringing them one step closer to open rebellion. The British Parliament's decision to send troops to occupy Boston in 1768 to enforce the Townshend Acts proved to be a critical turning point in the escalating tensions between the Crown and the colonies. The presence of a standing army in a major colonial city was deeply resented by the local population. The soldiers, many of whom were poorly paid and held in low regard, were seen not as protectors but as instruments of tyranny. This occupation created a volatile environment where daily interactions between soldiers and civilians were fraught with hostility, leading to frequent skirmishes and brawls. This atmosphere of a city under military rule set the stage for a tragic and pivotal confrontation. On the evening of March 5, 1770, a small crowd of colonists began to gather around a sentry post outside the custom house on King Street. The crowd, which grew to include dozens of men, began to taunt and harass the lone British soldier with insults and snowballs. The situation rapidly deteriorated as a small detachment of 7 soldiers, led by Captain Thomas Preston, was sent to reinforce the sentry. The crowd, now numbering over 100, became more aggressive, throwing not only snowballs but also oyster shells and other debris at the soldiers. The soldiers, with their backs against the wall and facing a hostile mob, were in a precarious position. Amidst the chaos, a soldier was knocked to the ground. In the confusion, and possibly believing a command had been given, the soldiers fired their muskets into the crowd. 11 men were hit, and 5 were killed, including Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and Native American descent, who is often considered the first casualty of the American Revolution. The deaths of these men, though a relatively small number, sent shockwaves throughout the colonies. The event was immediately seized upon by colonial propagandists, most famously Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, who skillfully used it to fuel anti-British sentiment. Paul Revere's engraving of the event, titled "The Bloody Massacre," depicted a disciplined line of British soldiers firing on an unarmed and peaceful crowd of civilians. This image, a powerful piece of visual propaganda, was widely distributed and became a potent symbol of British oppression. The legal aftermath of the incident was also significant. The soldiers were arrested and charged with murder. John Adams, a prominent Boston lawyer and future president, took on their defense. Despite the immense public pressure, Adams, who believed that the soldiers deserved a fair trial, argued that the soldiers were provoked and were acting in self-defense. The jury acquitted Captain Preston and most of the soldiers, convicting only 2 of the soldiers of manslaughter, a verdict that demonstrated that even in a climate of intense anti-British sentiment, the rule of law could prevail. However, the political fallout was irreversible. The Boston Massacre, as it came to be known, was a pivotal event in the lead-up to the Revolution, transforming the political conflict over taxation into a more visceral and violent struggle for colonial liberty. It was a tragic incident that was used to great effect to rally a growing revolutionary cause. The political tensions that led to the Boston Massacre in 1770 were temporarily diffused by the partial repeal of the Townshend Acts. However, one key tax remained in place: the duty on tea. This seemingly minor concession by Parliament was a calculated move. The British government retained the tax to assert its right to tax the colonies, a principle the colonists vehemently rejected. For the next 3 years, a tense calm prevailed, a period in which the most significant resistance came in the form of a successful boycott of legally imported British tea, with colonists instead buying smuggled Dutch tea. This status quo was shattered in 1773 by the passage of the Tea Act. The Tea Act was not a new tax. Its primary purpose was not to raise revenue, but to rescue the struggling British East India Company from financial collapse. The company, a powerful symbol of British mercantile capitalism, was burdened with a massive surplus of tea that it could not sell. The Tea Act granted the company a monopoly on the sale of tea in the colonies and allowed it to sell the tea directly to colonial merchants, bypassing the traditional middlemen. This measure, by cutting out colonial smugglers and merchants, made the company's tea significantly cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea that the colonists had been buying. The British government believed that the colonists, motivated by the lower price, would purchase the tea and, in doing so, would implicitly accept the parliamentary tax. However, the colonists saw the Tea Act not as a benefit, but as a dangerous trap. Colonial merchants, who had a profitable business in smuggled tea, were infuriated by the threat to their livelihoods. More importantly, colonial political leaders saw the act as a transparent attempt to force them to accept the principle of taxation without representation. They believed that if they accepted the cheap tea with its attached tax, it would set a precedent that would allow Parliament to pass any tax it wished. The issue was not the price of tea, but the principle of parliamentary authority. The colonial response was swift and organized. In various colonial ports, including Philadelphia and New York, colonists forced the tea ships to return to England. In Charleston, the tea was seized and stored in a warehouse, where it eventually spoiled. The most dramatic act of defiance occurred in Boston. On the evening of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists, organized by the Sons of Liberty and disguised as Native Americans, boarded 3 East India Company ships docked in Griffin's Wharf. In a coordinated and peaceful act of political protest, they systematically dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This event, which came to be known as the Boston Tea Party, was a powerful symbolic act. It was not a riot for personal gain, but a deliberate and public destruction of property to protest an imperial policy. The Tea Party was a direct challenge to the authority of the British government, and the British response to it would bring the colonies to the brink of revolution. The destruction of 342 chests of tea in Boston Harbor was a direct and unprecedented act of defiance against the authority of the British government. The act was a public challenge to imperial policy and a deliberate destruction of private property. Lord North's government in Britain, along with a majority in Parliament, saw this as a pivotal moment that required a swift and punitive response to reassert control. They believed that by punishing Massachusetts, they could isolate the radical elements in the colonies and deter similar protests elsewhere. Instead, their actions proved to be the final catalyst for colonial unity. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of 4 legislative measures, collectively known in Britain as the Coercive Acts. The colonists, however, quickly renamed them the Intolerable Acts, and their passage was a turning point in the imperial crisis. The first and most punitive of these was the Boston Port Act. This act, in retaliation for the Tea Party, closed the port of Boston to all trade until the East India Company was reimbursed for the destroyed tea. The intent was to cripple Boston's economy and starve the city into submission. The second measure was the Massachusetts Government Act. This act unilaterally revoked the colony's charter and effectively placed Massachusetts under direct British rule. The act replaced the elected colonial council with an appointed one, greatly restricted the authority of town meetings, and gave the royal governor the power to appoint all judges and sheriffs. This was a direct attack on the tradition of self-governance that the Massachusetts colonists had cherished for over a century, and it was seen as a dangerous precedent for all the other colonies. The third act was the Administration of Justice Act, which the colonists derisively called the Murder Act. It allowed any royal official or British soldier accused of a capital crime while enforcing imperial laws to be tried in England or another British colony, rather than in Massachusetts. The colonists believed this was a deliberate measure to protect British officials from colonial juries and to give them free license to commit acts of violence against the local population. The fourth measure was an Expanded Quartering Act, which applied to all the colonies and gave royal governors the power to house British soldiers in unoccupied buildings, including private homes and barns, without the consent of the local legislature. This act was seen as a direct violation of property rights and a continuation of the military occupation that had led to the Boston Massacre. In addition to these 4 acts, Parliament also passed the Quebec Act, which, while not a part of the Coercive Acts, was seen by the colonists as a hostile measure. It extended the boundaries of the Quebec province south to the Ohio River and granted religious freedom to French Catholics. The colonists saw this as a deliberate attempt to reward a rival population and to further restrict their own westward expansion. The Intolerable Acts had the opposite effect of what Parliament intended. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, they united the other colonies in sympathy and solidarity. Food and supplies were sent overland to Boston from throughout the colonies, and the call for a new intercolonial congress was heard. The punitive measures had failed to divide the colonies. Instead, they had solidified a common cause and a collective resolve to resist what was now viewed as a tyrannical government. The British Parliament's passage of the Coercive Acts in 1774, intended to isolate and punish Massachusetts, had the opposite effect, galvanizing colonial unity and accelerating the move toward collective action. The punitive measures, which the colonists derisively called the Intolerable Acts, were seen as a direct threat to the liberties of all colonies. In this climate of heightened tension, a call for a new intercolonial congress was heard. This gathering would not be a mere meeting of delegates, but the first time that the colonies would act as a single political body to address a common grievance. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. Georgia was the only one absent, due to its reliance on British military aid for protection against Native American raids convened in Philadelphia at Carpenter's Hall. The First Continental Congress was a gathering of some of the most prominent political leaders in the colonies, including Samuel Adams and John Adams from Massachusetts, George Washington and Patrick Henry from Virginia, and John Jay from New York. This diverse group of men, representing a wide range of colonial interests and political ideologies, faced the difficult task of forging a unified response. The delegates were deeply divided between those who sought a radical break from Britain and those who favoured a more moderate approach of reconciliation. The debates within the Congress were intense, and several key outcomes emerged. The delegates first endorsed the Suffolk Resolves, a series of declarations from Suffolk County, Massachusetts, that proclaimed the coercive acts to be unconstitutional and called on the people of Massachusetts to form their own government and withhold taxes from the Crown. This endorsement was a powerful show of solidarity and a clear signal of the Congress's intent to resist British authority. The Congress then drafted the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, a formal petition to King George III that articulated the colonists' rights as Englishmen, including the right to life, liberty, and property, and protested the coercive acts as a violation of those rights. The petition, while firm in its resolve, was a gesture of reconciliation, appealing to the king to redress their grievances. The most significant action of the Congress was the formation of the Continental Association. This was a system of economic boycotts of all British goods. The delegates agreed to stop all imports from Britain, and if Parliament did not repeal the coercive acts, they would stop all exports to Britain the following year. This was a powerful and coordinated form of economic warfare, and the Congress established local committees of inspection in each colony to enforce the boycott. The association was, in effect, the first unified government of the colonies, as its committees held de facto authority in many local areas. The First Continental Congress concluded its session in October 1774, having failed to achieve reconciliation but having succeeded in creating a unified political and economic front against the British. The delegates agreed to meet again in May 1775 if their grievances were not addressed, a decision that would prove to be prophetic. The political and economic tensions that had simmered for a decade between Great Britain and its American colonies erupted into open warfare in April 1775. The First Continental Congress, having created a unified front of resistance, had disbanded in October 1774 with a plan to reconvene the following year if their grievances were not addressed. In the interim, colonial militias, particularly in Massachusetts, were preparing for a potential conflict, stockpiling weapons and ammunition and drilling regularly. This military readiness was not lost on General Thomas Gage, the British Commander-in-Chief in North America and the Royal Governor of Massachusetts. Gage, who was aware of the colonists' military preparations, received orders from London to assert British authority and disarm the rebel militias. The immediate catalyst for the fighting was Gage's decision to launch a surprise raid on a colonial militia weapons depot in Concord, Massachusetts. On the night of April 18, 1775, a British force of approximately 700 soldiers, known as the Redcoats, marched out of Boston under the cover of darkness. Their objective was to seize the military supplies and, if possible, to arrest the revolutionary leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were believed to be in Lexington. However, the British plan was compromised. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott, acting as riders for the Sons of Liberty, rode through the countryside to warn the colonial militias of the approaching British forces. In the early morning hours of April 19th, the British column reached the town of Lexington, where they were met by a small group of about 70 militiamen, or Minutemen, on the town green. The militiamen, under the command of Captain John Parker, were not an organised army, but a local force gathered to confront the British. The two sides faced each other in a tense standoff. A shot was fired, the source of which remains a subject of historical debate, and the British soldiers, believing they were under attack, unleashed a volley of musket fire. 8 militiamen were killed and 10 were wounded in the ensuing chaos. The skirmish lasted only a few minutes, but it was the first armed conflict of the American Revolution, and the shot heard round the world had been fired. The British then continued their march to Concord. Upon their arrival, they found that the majority of the military supplies had been moved or hidden. A brief engagement occurred at the North Bridge, where a larger force of colonial militiamen, numbering around 400, successfully repelled the British regulars. The Redcoats, having failed in their primary objective, began their long and arduous march back to Boston. Their retreat, however, was a disaster. Thousands of colonial militiamen, alerted by the riders and the sounds of battle, had gathered along the route. From behind trees, stone walls, and buildings, the colonists engaged in a persistent and effective guerrilla-style attack, inflicting a continuous hail of gunfire on the retreating Redcoats. The British suffered heavy casualties, with over 250 men killed or wounded. The battles of Lexington and Concord, though tactically small, were a monumental strategic victory for the colonists. The colonial militias, which had been considered an undisciplined rabble, had proven that they could stand up to and defeat the best trained army in the world. The events of that day transformed a political crisis into an armed revolution. The battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775, while tactically small, had immense strategic consequences. The spontaneous colonial response to the British raid demonstrated a new military resolve and effectively trapped the British forces inside the city of Boston. What began as a series of skirmishes quickly transformed into a formal military standoff, with thousands of colonial militiamen converging on Boston from across New England. The siege of Boston had begun, a protracted and critical period that would define the early course of the war. The colonial forces surrounding Boston were not a professional army, but a loosely organized collection of militia units. This New England army was composed of men from Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island, all serving under their own commanders and with their own regulations. Despite their lack of formal training and discipline, their sheer numbers, estimated at over 15,000, allowed them to effectively blockade the city. The British forces, under General Thomas Gage, were confined to Boston and Charlestown, relying entirely on the sea for supplies and reinforcements. The siege was punctuated by one major battle that demonstrated both the determination of the colonial forces and the immense human cost of direct confrontation with British regulars. On June 17, 1775, British forces launched a frontal assault on the colonial positions at Breed's Hill, a fortified position across the harbour from Boston. The engagement, though often referred to as the Battle of Bunker Hill, was a hard-fought and bloody affair. The colonial militiamen famously ordered not to fire until you see the whites of their eyes, inflicted devastating casualties on the advancing British troops. The British, however, ultimately succeeded in taking the hill after the colonists ran out of ammunition. While a tactical victory for the British, their losses were staggering. Over 1,000 casualties out of a force of 2,400 men. The battle, though a loss for the colonists, was a major morale booster, as it proved that they could stand their ground against the most disciplined army in the world. A key development during the siege was the establishment of a unified military command. In June 1775, the Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, voted to adopt the New England Army as the Continental Army. They appointed George Washington, a Virginian with considerable military experience from the French and Indian War, as its commander-in-chief. Washington's arrival in Cambridge in July was a critical moment, as he immediately began the difficult task of transforming the undisciplined militias into a professional fighting force. The siege concluded in March 1776, after the Continental Army, now more organized, managed to place artillery on Dorchester Heights, a strategic position overlooking Boston. The guns, which had been hauled from Fort Ticonderoga in New York in a monumental logistical effort by Colonel Henry Knox, made the British position in Boston untenable. General William Howe, who had replaced Gage, evacuated his forces from the city, sailing with over 9,000 soldiers and nearly 1,000 loyalists to Halifax, Nova Scotia. The siege of Boston was a monumental achievement for the colonists. They had successfully expelled the British Army from a major American city and, in the process, had created the Continental Army, a professional military force with a unified command structure ready to fight for a new nation. The outbreak of open hostilities at Lexington and Concord in April 1775 fundamentally altered the political landscape of the British American colonies. In the wake of this armed conflict, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in May 1775. This gathering of delegates, representing all 13 colonies, faced the immediate and unprecedented task of acting as a de facto government for a people now in rebellion. The transition from a body of protest to a governing entity was slow and contentious, but military necessity compelled the Congress to take on the responsibilities of a sovereign power. The most pressing issue was the military situation in Massachusetts, where thousands of colonial militiamen were besieging the British Army in Boston. This force, while large, was undisciplined and lacked a central command structure. To address this, the Congress took two critical steps. First, it voted to adopt these militias and formally establish the Continental Army, a unified fighting force for all the colonies. This act nationalized the military effort and was a powerful symbol of collective purpose. Second, the Congress appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief. Washington, a delegate from Virginia and a respected veteran of the French and Indian War, was chosen for his military experience and his reputation for integrity. His selection was also a politically calculated move, as it brought a prominent Virginian to the head of a primarily New England army, thus uniting the northern and southern colonies behind a common leader. Despite these actions, a powerful moderate faction within the Congress, led by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, still hoped for a peaceful resolution. This group drafted the Olive Branch Petition in July 1775, a final appeal to King George III that reaffirmed colonial loyalty and implored him to intervene to end the hostilities. The petition was a last-ditch effort at reconciliation, but it was doomed to fail. King George III, influenced by his ministers, refused to even read the petition. In August 1775, he issued a royal proclamation declaring the colonies to be in a state of open rebellion. The king's refusal to negotiate, coupled with the ongoing violence of the conflict, gradually eroded the influence of the moderates. The British blockade of colonial ports, the burning of coastal towns, and the king's decision to hire foreign mercenaries, the Hessians convinced a growing number of delegates that independence was the only viable path. The Congress, through its actions creating a postal system, printing its own money, and seeking foreign alliances, was already operating as an independent government. The king's intransigence and the military escalation of the conflict had pushed the colonies past the point of no return. The formal declaration of independence was no longer a question of if, but when. As the Second Continental Congress deliberated on the possibility of independence, a pamphlet was published in January 1776 that would galvanize public opinion and provide the intellectual foundation for the American Revolution. Titled Common Sense, this radical and influential work was written by Thomas Paine, a recent English immigrant to the colonies. Paine's pamphlet was a direct and powerful assault on the British monarchy and the concept of hereditary rule, and its arguments shifted the focus of the colonial debate from a redress of grievances to a full and complete separation from Great Britain. Before Common Sense, the majority of colonists, even those in rebellion, saw their conflict with Britain as a struggle for their rights as Englishmen, not as a rejection of the monarchy itself. They blamed Parliament and the king's ministers for their woes, often believing that a good and just king would set things right if he were only aware of their suffering. Paine's pamphlet systematically dismantled this belief. He argued that the British monarchy, and King George III in particular, was not a benevolent institution, but a tyrannical one. He mocked the idea of hereditary succession, famously stating that one honest man was worth more than all the crown ruffians who had ever lived. This direct and accessible critique of the monarchy was a powerful and revolutionary idea that resonated with a broad audience. Paine's arguments were not just a criticism of the monarchy, they were a passionate defense of republicanism. He made a clear case for why America, a continent, should not be ruled by an island. He argued that the sheer distance between Britain and the colonies made effective governance impossible. He also pointed out that America's future lay in its ability to trade freely with all nations, not in its subservience to the mercantile interests of a single one. Paine's style was deliberately simple and direct, a stark contrast to the dense legal and philosophical arguments of other revolutionary thinkers. He wrote in a plain, conversational tone that was understandable to the common person, making his ideas accessible to a mass audience. The impact of common sense was immediate and profound. Within 3 months, over 120,000 copies were sold, making it the best-selling and most influential pamphlet in American history. It was read aloud in taverns and public meetings, and its arguments were debated in homes and fields. The pamphlet's success fundamentally changed the terms of the debate, pushing the moderate faction in the Continental Congress to the margins and making independence a legitimate and desirable goal for a majority of the population. The pamphlet provided a clear and compelling justification for revolution, and it gave the colonists the confidence to believe that they could and should govern themselves. Common sense was the intellectual and moral fire that ignited the final march toward independence. By the spring of 1776, the momentum for independence had become undeniable. Thomas Paine's common sense had shifted public opinion, and the rejection of the Olive Branch Petition by King George III had convinced a majority of the delegates in the Second Continental Congress that reconciliation was no longer a viable option. The Congress, now operating as a central government for the colonies, was already waging a war and seeking foreign alliances. A formal declaration of independence was the next logical and necessary step. It would not only provide a moral and philosophical justification for the rebellion, but would also be a powerful tool for securing foreign aid, particularly from France. The formal process began on June 7th, 1776, when Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution to the Congress stating that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The resolution was met with debate, as some delegates, particularly those from the middle colonies, still harbored reservations about a final break with Britain. To manage the process, the Congress appointed a 5-man committee: Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston to draft a formal statement of independence. Jefferson, a respected Virginian lawyer and a skilled writer, was given the primary responsibility for the document. Jefferson's draft was a masterful synthesis of Enlightenment political philosophy and a direct articulation of colonial grievances. He drew upon the works of thinkers like John Locke, whose theories of natural rights and the social contract were foundational to the document's argument. The Declaration's most famous lines, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," were a radical departure from the tradition of rights granted by the monarchy and asserted a new political philosophy based on natural law. The Declaration argued that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive of these ends, the people have a right to alter or abolish it. The second part of the declaration was a long and detailed list of grievances against King George III, a deliberate strategy to place the blame for the conflict squarely on the monarch rather than on Parliament. This list, which included complaints about taxation without consent, the quartering of troops, and the denial of trial by jury, served as a powerful indictment of the king's tyranny and a justification for the rebellion. After some revisions and edits by the committee and the full Congress, the Declaration of Independence was formally adopted on July 2, 1776, though the document itself was not formally signed until August 2. The Declaration was more than a mere statement of political intent. It was a formal severing of ties between the colonies and Great Britain, and a foundational document of a new nation. It articulated a new philosophy of government and a new sense of American identity, one rooted in the principles of liberty, equality, and self-determination. The formal Declaration of Independence transformed a civil war into a war between two nations and, in doing so, created the intellectual and moral basis for a new republic. Following the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution entered a new and precarious phase. The British government, now viewing the conflict as a full-scale war between two nations, responded with a more determined military effort. However, a pivotal series of battles in upstate New York in 1777 would prove to be the turning point of the war and lead to a decisive American victory. The British plan was a three-pronged strategy designed to sever New England, the heart of the rebellion, from the other colonies. The main force, commanded by General John Burgoyne, would march south from Canada down the Hudson River Valley. A second, smaller force, under Colonel Barry St. Ledger, would move east from Lake Ontario, and a third, larger force, under General William Howe, would move north from New York City. The three armies were to converge on Albany, New York, a strategic hub. The British plan was flawed from the outset. St. Leger's force was bogged down by a siege at Fort Stanwix and was eventually forced to retreat. More critically, General Howe, instead of moving north to meet Burgoyne, chose to capture Philadelphia, the seat of the Continental Congress, a move that left Burgoyne's army isolated and unsupported. Burgoyne's army, a force of approximately 7,000 British regulars, Hessians and Canadian loyalists, had an initially successful march south from Canada, capturing Fort Ticonderoga in July. However, their progress soon became a logistical nightmare. The dense forests and difficult terrain, combined with American forces' tactic of felling trees and destroying bridges, slowed their advance to a crawl. The American forces, under the command of General Horatio Gates, were gathering strength at Saratoga, a strategic location on the west bank of the Hudson. The two armies first met at the Battle of Freeman's Farm on September 19th. The British, though holding the field, suffered heavy casualties. The American forces, which included a brilliant and aggressive brigade commanded by General Benedict Arnold, proved to be a formidable opponent. Burgoyne, now isolated and facing a growing American army, was in a desperate position. His army was running out of supplies, and with no sign of reinforcements from the south, he was forced to dig in. The decisive engagement occurred on October 7th at the Battle of Bemis Heights. American forces, again led by Arnold, launched a furious assault on the British positions. The British line broke under the pressure, and Burgoyne's army was completely surrounded. On October the 17th, 1777, Burgoyne, with his army of nearly 6,000 men exhausted and out of food, formally surrendered to General Gates. The Battle of Saratoga was a monumental American victory. It was the first time that a large British army had ever surrendered in open battle, and it convinced the French, who had been secretly providing aid to the Americans, that the colonists had a real chance of winning the war. The victory at Saratoga led directly to a formal alliance with France, which would provide the Americans with the naval power, military supplies, and financial aid that were essential for victory. The war, which had begun as an internal rebellion, was now a global conflict, and the Americans, with the help of a powerful ally, were now in a position to win. After the devastating defeat at Saratoga in 1777, the British military command shifted its strategic focus to the southern colonies. The new strategy, often referred to as the Southern Strategy, was based on the belief that a strong loyalist population existed in the south. The British military hoped that by landing troops in the region and holding key ports, they could rally the support of loyalists, raise local militias, and, with the help of these allies, gradually bring the southern colonies back under royal control. The plan was to then move north, effectively squeezing the rebellion from both directions. This strategy was predicated on a miscalculation of the strength and political will of the loyalist population. The campaign began with a significant British success in 1778, with the capture of Savannah, Georgia. This victory provided the British with a key southern port and a base of operations. The following year, General Sir Henry Clinton, with a force of 8,500 men, captured Charleston, South Carolina, a major port and the largest city in the South. The American forces, under General Benjamin Lincoln, were trapped in the city and forced to surrender, a catastrophic loss of over 5,000 men. These early victories seemed to validate the British strategy, and for a time it appeared that the South was on the verge of falling. However, the British soon found themselves embroiled in a new and complex form of warfare. The Southern Theatre was not a traditional European conflict of large set-piece battles. Instead, it was characterized by a brutal and persistent guerrilla war waged by American militias. Figures like Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, and Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, led small bands of irregulars who, with a deep knowledge of the local terrain, launched devastating surprise attacks on British supply lines and isolated outposts. These militias, while often defeated in direct confrontation, proved to be an effective check on British mobility and control. The British, in their attempts to suppress these forces, often resorted to brutal tactics that alienated the very loyalist population they had hoped to win over. The British campaign was led by General Lord Charles Cornwallis, a capable and determined commander who found himself in a frustrating war of attrition. While Cornwallis achieved some notable victories in pitched battles, such as the Battle of Camden in 1780 and the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in 1781, these were often Pyrrhic victories, with British casualties proving too high to sustain. The American forces, now under the command of General Nathanael Greene, employed a strategy of retreat and harassment, wearing down the British army with a series of minor engagements. The British, with their long supply lines stretched thin and facing a relentless guerrilla war, found themselves in an untenable position. The Southern strategy, which was designed to win the war, was now leading the British into a political and military quagmire that would ultimately lead to their final and decisive defeat. Following the frustrating war of attrition in the southern colonies, General Lord Charles Cornwallis, his army battered and exhausted, made a fateful strategic decision. In the spring of 1781, he marched his forces from North Carolina into Virginia, a move that he believed would allow him to cut off American supply lines and rally loyalist support. However, this action ran contrary to the orders of his superior, General Sir Henry Clinton, who wanted Cornwallis to hold a defensive position in the Carolinas. Cornwallis, with his forces now in Virginia, was a long distance from British-held territory and vulnerable. He eventually moved his army to the coastal town of Yorktown, a position on the Chesapeake Bay. He chose to maintain communications with the British Navy and receive reinforcements and supplies. The American and French Allied forces, seeing an opportunity to trap Cornwallis's army, immediately devised a coordinated plan. General George Washington, with his Continental Army and the French Army, under the command of the Comte de Rochambeau, were stationed near New York City, preparing for a potential assault on the city. Upon learning of Cornwallis's position at Yorktown, Washington, in a masterful act of strategic deception, swiftly marched his combined army of approximately 17,000 men south toward Virginia. This movement was kept secret from the British, who believed the Allied forces were still preparing to attack New York. The success of the Allied plan hinged on a crucial component: French naval superiority. In late August 1781, a large French fleet from the West Indies, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, sailed into the Chesapeake Bay. This fleet, which included 28 ships of the line, successfully defeated a British fleet under Admiral Thomas Graves at the Battle of the Chesapeake, forcing the British to retreat. This naval victory was the most critical element of the siege, as it effectively sealed off any possibility of a British naval escape or a seaborne resupply of Cornwallis's army. Cornwallis and his 7,500 troops were now completely surrounded by land and sea. The siege of Yorktown began on September 28, 1781. The Allied forces, with the help of French engineers, began a methodical and systematic bombardment of the British positions. They established a siege line, dug parallel trenches to bring their heavy artillery closer to the British defences, and launched a continuous barrage that destroyed British redoubts and demoralised the troops. Cornwallis's position became untenable, and his forces, facing constant bombardment and a dwindling supply of ammunition and food, were unable to mount an effective defence or launch a counterattack. After weeks of relentless shelling, and with no hope of a naval rescue, Cornwallis was forced to negotiate a surrender. On October 19, 1781, his army formally surrendered to the combined American and French forces. The siege of Yorktown was the final major battle of the American Revolution. The surrender of a large British army was a catastrophic loss for the British government. And though the war would not formally end for another 2 years, the defeat at Yorktown effectively ended the British will to continue the fight for their North American colonies. The surrender of General Cornwallis at Yorktown in October 1781 was a catastrophic loss for the British, and effectively ended the British will to continue the fight for their North American colonies. While some fighting continued for another 2 years, the British government, led by Prime Minister Lord North, was now under immense public and political pressure to end the costly war. The defeat at Yorktown, combined with the ongoing global war against France, Spain, and the Netherlands, had made the war for America strategically and financially untenable. Formal peace negotiations began in Paris in April 1782, with a distinguished American delegation consisting of Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. The American delegation's primary objective was to secure formal recognition of American independence. However, the negotiations were complicated by the interests of America's European allies. France, which had provided crucial military and financial aid, sought to protect its own interests and those of Spain, its ally, in the war. France had entered the war with a treaty that prohibited either nation from making a separate peace with Britain. The American delegates, particularly John Jay, grew suspicious that France and Spain might be willing to compromise on American interests to secure their own territorial gains. This suspicion led the American delegation to begin secret, separate negotiations with the British. The British, led by Prime Minister Lord Shelburne, were also eager to end the war. They saw an opportunity to split the American and French alliance and offered generous terms to the Americans to secure a swift peace. The British understood that a rapid settlement with the Americans would allow them to focus on their remaining European rivals. The separate negotiations proved successful, and a preliminary treaty was signed between Britain and the United States in November 1782, a critical violation of America's treaty with France. Franklin, Adams, and Jay, in a diplomatic coup, had secured a highly favorable peace for the new nation. The final Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3, 1783. The treaty's provisions were a monumental achievement for the United States. First, and most importantly, Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. Second, the treaty established the new nation's boundaries, granting it all the land from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River and from Canada down to Florida. This immense territorial grant was far more than the Americans had initially controlled and was a powerful foundation for the new republic's future expansion. Third, the treaty granted Americans fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland, a valuable economic concession. Finally, the treaty included provisions for the payment of pre-war debts to British creditors and the return of property to loyalists, though these provisions were largely ignored by the states. The Treaty of Paris officially ended the American Revolution, marking the formal birth of the United States and the first major loss of territory and prestige for the British Empire. It was a diplomatic victory that enshrined the principles of the Declaration of Independence in international law and began a new chapter in the history of the British Empire. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially ended the American Revolution, but it did not bring immediate stability to the newly independent nation or the remaining British Empire. For the British, the loss of the 13 colonies was a profound strategic and psychological blow, forcing a re-evaluation of its imperial policies and a new focus on its remaining territories. For the Americans, the victory was the beginning of a long and difficult process of nation-building, with a complex and often tragic aftermath for a significant portion of its population. The Loyalists. The fate of the Loyalists, those who had remained faithful to the British Crown, was a direct and painful consequence of the war. Approximately 500,000 colonists, or 15,000, 20% of the population, had actively supported the British. They were a diverse group, including wealthy merchants, subsistence farmers, and enslaved Africans who had been promised freedom in exchange for their service. During the war, many Loyalists were subjected to harassment, violence, and confiscation of their property. The Treaty of Paris had included a provision that the United States would recommend to the states that they restore Loyalist property and end their persecution, but this provision was largely ignored. The newly formed states, fueled by revolutionary zeal, passed laws that confiscated Loyalist property and banished them from their homes. Facing persecution and a hostile new government, tens of thousands of Loyalists fled the United States. Their mass exodus was a significant demographic event. Approximately 80,000 Loyalists, including both white and black refugees, were evacuated by the British Army and Navy. The majority of these refugees, about 35,000, settled in the remaining British territories in North America, particularly Nova Scotia and Quebec. This influx of a new population, many of whom were educated and politically active, had a profound impact on the development of Canada. The British government, seeking to reward the loyalty of these refugees, created a new colony, New Brunswick, and passed the Constitutional Act of 1791, which divided Quebec into two separate provinces, Upper Canada predominantly English-speaking and Lower Canada predominantly French-speaking. This act was a deliberate strategy to accommodate the Loyalist population and to create a separate political identity for the remaining British colonies in North America. The American Revolution forced the British government to rethink its entire imperial model. The loss of the North American colonies, which had been the primary focus of its colonial policy, demonstrated the dangers of both salutary neglect and direct taxation without representation. This realization would lead to a new era of imperial administration. The British, having lost their North American empire, would now focus their ambitions on new regions, particularly India, the Pacific, and Africa. where a different set of political and economic dynamics would define the next phase of global expansion. The end of the war for the American colonies was the beginning of a new chapter for the British Empire, one defined by the lessons learned from a costly defeat. The loss of the 13 American colonies in 1783 was not the end of the British Empire, but a profound turning point that forced a fundamental re-evaluation of its imperial philosophy and administration. The defeat demonstrated the limitations of the mercantilist system, which had defined the empire for over a century. That system, based on the belief that colonies existed to serve the economic interests of the mother country, was exposed as both unworkable and unsustainable in the face of colonial resistance and the costs of enforcement. The lessons learned from this costly defeat would shape the trajectory of what is often referred to as the Second British Empire. The most immediate consequence was a philosophical shift from mercantilism to a more liberal approach to international trade. The political economist Adam Smith, whose influential work The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, had argued that a nation's wealth was not measured by its gold reserves, but by the productivity of its citizens and its capacity for free trade. The American Revolution, with its success in using economic boycotts and its demand for free commerce, provided a powerful real-world case study for Smith's theories. The British government, no longer bound by the need to enforce its trade monopoly on its former colonies, began a slow but deliberate transition toward a system of free trade, a policy that would define its global economic dominance in the 19th century. The loss of the American colonies also forced a geographic shift in imperial focus. While a new colonial government was being established in what would become Canada, Britain's ambitions were now redirected to new regions. India, where the East India Company had already transitioned from a commercial entity to a military and political power, became the new centerpiece of the empire. The British government, mindful of its recent colonial rebellion, passed a series of acts to increase parliamentary oversight of the company's affairs, a direct lesson from the unmanaged corruption and mismanagement that had led to the Bengal famine. The defeat also spurred a new wave of exploration and settlement in the Pacific. James Cook's voyages in the 1770s had already provided Britain with claims to Australia and New Zealand, and the loss of America as a destination for convicts created an immediate need for a new penal colony. The First Fleet, carrying convicts and a small garrison, sailed to Australia in 1787 to establish a settlement at what would become Sydney. This marked the beginning of Britain's colonization of Australia, a new imperial project that was far removed from the political traditions of the American colonies. The British Empire, having lost its first, most valuable possessions, was now being reborn in a new era, defined by a more liberal economic philosophy and a renewed focus on global expansion into new and different regions. The American Revolution did not end the British Empire. It transformed it, setting the stage for its next and even more expansive phase.